So this is the moment you've been waiting for. We have a very important guest with us here today. And so I'm just going to take a couple minutes to share a few things about Vint that you may not know. So Vint is the Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google. He's held positions at MCI, the Corporation for National Research Initiatives, Stanford University, UCLA, and IBM. Vint was the chairman of the Internet Board, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN. Those of you in IT will know what that is. And he served as the US National Science Board from 2013 to 2018. What excites me is that Vint is known as one of the fathers of the Internet. He received the National Medal of Technology in 1997. In November 2005, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In April 2008, the Japan Prize, and in March 2013, the Queen Elizabeth II Prize of Engineering. Vint received his Bachelor's of Science degree in Mathematics from Stanford University and Master's of Science and PhD in Computer Science from UCLA. And he holds, get this, 29 honorary degrees from universities around the world. So Vint, it's my pleasure and an honor to welcome you to the stage here and to spend the next few minutes picking your brain about some things. And just to sort of get things going, I'm going to start off with somewhat of a joke. You were one of the people who ended up creating the internet in the beginning. And so my first question to you is, why did you all create it so insecurely? But again, that's tongue in cheek. There is a lot that we can sort of give thanks for now with having the internet with us. It's more than just going and browsing things now. It's about our finances, it's about health, intellectual property. All these things are now available through the internet and need some level of protection. And so for all the benefits that the internet I've created over the years, as one of the creators, have you or some of your fellow creators of the internet sort of said, wow, what did we do? Did we create a monster or not? Vint, you're muted.
Thank you. That must be the most common expression in the last 18 months is you're on mute. Anyway, about those 29 honorary degrees, the Latin for that is honoris causa, which roughly translated as you didn't earn this. So don't get too excited about that. Look, when the internet design was being done, Bob Kahn and I knew, of course, that the motivation was command and control for the Defense Department, and obviously security is a major consideration. In fact, we had launched and pursued a secure design of the system. We were using equipment that was classified in order to do the early work. And so we weren't able to share a lot of the specifics at that point. And then, of course, we had to invent packet cryptography, because up until that time, most of the crypto was for stream type stuff, which is continuous link encryption, as opposed to the kind of cryptography that allowed you to decrypt packets out of order, for example, which is a non-trivial exercise. In fact, I was pursuing that as early as 1975 with the National Security Agency. And we did, in fact, develop technology, which eventually turned into technology like Blacker and some of the other packet crypto capabilities. However, you should keep in mind that the period of time when we were beginning that work was just prior to the point where public key crypto was announced as a possibility. The first papers came out in 1976 as I arrived at DARPA. But those papers from Whit Diffie and Marty Hellman at Stanford speculated on the existence of mathematical objects that would have these properties of public key crypto with the two different keys, one to encrypt and one to decrypt. But they didn't necessarily offer algorithms for that. And by the time things like RSA came along, I was deep into trying to freeze the protocols in order to get them implemented on as many operating systems as we could, so I could show that this actually worked. So some of you will remember, or at least have read about a 1977 demo of 3 networks being interconnected, showing TCP/IP was working. By 1978, we're freezing everything. My expectation at the time was twofold. The first one is that I believed that we could retrofit a substantial amount of security into the internet's architecture because it was so layered and flexible. And as all of you know, there are many layers at which we have introduced cryptographic methods, DNSSEC, IPsec, TLS, QUIC most recently, the public key, what do I want to say, the RPKI, the routing public key infrastructure, which will help us protect BGP, for example. It won't protect us, however, from the thing that happened to Facebook, because that was basically shoot yourself in the foot action, as far as I know. But I wanted to draw your attention to another factoid here. Some of you will have heard of something called the snowflake curve. If you haven't heard about it, you could Google it, or you could draw one, because you start with a triangle, and then you divide each of the lines of that triangle into thirds, and you draw another equilateral triangle in the middle third. And you just keep doing that over and over again. It turns out that that curve has infinite dimension if you continue to extend the practice. Why do I tell you about that? Because it's a visual for the security perimeter of the internet. In other words, the perimeter is nearly infinite, which means that the hackers have a nearly infinite opportunity to go after everything. Because no matter how hard you work on the perimeter, there's always somebody who didn't lock the door. So what that tells you is that if you're serious about security, you're going to have to introduce it, not just at the perimeter of the network, but in many layers in the architecture. So you'll find people saying things like, "Oh, we need to put everything in this geographical location and then build a big wall around it." And my response to that is, "Excuse me, but the internet penetrates the wall. And unless you build in additional security mechanisms in higher layers in the architecture, the perimeter defense is not going to work very well." So all this is to say that securing the internet is a huge challenge. And it's not just the underlying router system and the forwarding system and things like that, but it's every damn piece of software in every mobile, in every laptop, in every server, in every cloud system that needs attention in order to achieve the security that we're looking for. The good news is that you don't absolutely have to secure every single, billion devices on the internet in order to achieve security, but you do have to pay considerable attention to the portion of the internet that you're using, and you have to ask questions about how is security implemented in the parts that I care about and that I'm depending on. So, the answer is, there is one other observation to be made about this whole story. When the work was beginning, it was being done by graduate students at a dozen universities around the US, plus a couple of research institutions. The last people in the world that you would expect to exercise discipline about key management and everything else is a bunch of graduate students, because, insult intended, the graduate students have other priorities like graduating. And so the discipline that's required is very hard to enforce. We want to make it simpler, and in some of the earlier sessions today, which I happened to drop into and listen to a little bit, simplification is super important when you can get away with it. Make security easier for people to exercise, otherwise they won't bother. So finding tools for people to secure themselves is very important. Two-factor authentication is lovely, but if you have 300 accounts and you need 300 dongles and you can't figure out which one goes to which account, this is not helpful. So we need devices that are scalable in terms of introducing two-factor capability over multiple accounts, for example. Okay, I'll stop there. That's my defense, and I'm sticking with it.
No, but you mentioned something talking about going back all the way to 1975 when you were thinking about doing things more securely. So if you think about it, some of these solutions that exist today to help make the internet a little bit more secure have existed for a long time. A lot of these things are not new, maybe newer versions. So, what do you think? What's causing us to be so slow to adopting some of these things that would have made things a little bit more secure over the years if they were implemented?
Well, if you remember a movie called The Graduate, you'll remember that the guy whispers in the guy's ear, plastics. And the word I will whisper in your ear, virtually speaking, is incentives. What we need to do is to create incentives for all the various actors in this space to implement more secure systems, whether it's spending money on security or exercising good behavior, good security hygiene. We need to create incentives for that. And often it's seen as a cost, which does not produce, an increase in revenue, for example. Now, there are ways of creating incentives. To give you an example, which may not be precisely applicable, when it was concluded that seatbelts were important in cars to keep people from getting killed in an accident, we did several things in order to provide incentive. We said to the car manufacturers, you're not selling another car in the US if it doesn't have seatbelts in it. And then we told the drivers, if we catch you driving without the seatbelt on, there will be consequences. So creating incentive, those are sort of negative incentives in some sense, but creating incentives, negative or positive, are essential for succeeding at securing systems. But I want to re-emphasize again the simplicity of the tools that people can use to exercise security hygiene is also very important. Now, in certain contexts, it's possible to create significant incentive. As an example, at Google, I have to use two-factor authentication. I cannot get into any of my work without it. So I have little devices that are plugged into my USB ports that do a significant end-to-end authentication and cryptographic handshake to authenticate me to the system. There are other attempts to do that using mobiles, for example. I don't think SMS is a very secure mechanism, so I'm not a big fan of that. But there are some hardware implementations of mobiles that will include trusted modules and cryptographic generators that would serve just as well as plugging something into a USB port. So we need to work hard to make this easy for the users, for one thing. And if we get there, I think it will be easier to get people to be more thoughtful about their use. But the general public is a big challenge because you don't have the same kind of top-down, you can't work here unless you do X, Y, and Z. So how do we make that easy for our general population? That, by the way, is super important because if you think about national security and you think about protecting our borders and you think about avoiding attack or defending against an attack, that's one kind of security. But I think of national security in another sense, and that is the cyber space that we occupy is everywhere. Every single person in the country has some piece of cyber equipment, whether it's just a smart toaster or it's a sophisticated mobile. And they are at risk, and therefore the country is at risk. Mm-hmm. If ransomware strikes, as we saw in the Colonial Pipeline, there are all kinds of cascade consequences of some of these things. And it could be just one person's laptop that gets wiped out, which turns out to be the one thing that was needed in order to do something else. You remember the poem, "For want of a nail, the kingdom was lost." That's exactly what we see here. So we need to find ways of protecting the general public and all of their equipment as well. Once again, incentives are important. Standards may be very important. Compliance with standards may be very important. Just like the Underwriters Laboratory says you can't sell an electrical appliance unless we validated that it's safe. We may need to do the moral equivalent of Underwriters Laboratory for cyber-based equipment in order to protect the general public.
So Vint, you mentioned a lot of things there, and as you can tell, as a CISO, I'm looking at this as it's very expensive to do these kinds of incentive programs, especially if you're going to go it alone, right? So you mentioned the seatbelt example, and that was a combination of government and others working together to make that possible. So we have a number of people in the audience today who are from different backgrounds, from the federal government, state government, the insurance industry. We have students. So as you think about incentives in sort of a positive way, how could we compensate people or incentivize people to do the right things? What message do you have for these different audience members that we have with us today?
Well, there are several. For example, on the insurance side, there are some insurance companies who are trying to figure out whether a cyber insurance policy is something they can offer as a product. And their big problem associated with that is figuring out what the premium should be. What are the risk factors? It's possible, though, if you figure that out, then you can give people a break on the insurance premium if they exercise certain practices that can persuade you that their software development or software use is more secure and safer than someone else's. So that's one possible incentive that you could imagine. Another one, of course, is government procurement could require certain kinds of compliance. An example of this is the National Institutes for Standards and Technology specifies an evaluation called FedRAMP, which determines whether or not the cloud-based offering or a computer-based offering to the government is satisfactory from the security point of view. And you can't sell to the government unless you meet these compliance requirements. Now, you can have big arguments over whether the compliance requirement is adequate and suitable and reasonable, and we can have all those arguments. But setting aside that debate, the idea that there is an incentive for following those compliance practices is important. And by the way, that could happen on an international scale as well. You may have similar kinds of requirements showing up. The European Union has a number of demands that it places on everyone. The GDPR for privacy, for example, and I'm sure we'll see other evolutions along those same lines. So yes, it costs more, but if you can't sell unless you achieve those targets, those compliance targets, that might be one of the ways of steering people in a safer direction. Another thing, just to reinforce this, is that people need to understand that they are not safe in the online environment unless they adopt cyber hygiene practices. And historically, that was change your password all the time. I really don't think that's helpful because you can never remember a password from one thing. So you end up with Post-its on your laptop. Two-factor authentication, and something that was mentioned in one of the earlier talks about avoiding having to remember passwords because you use a different mechanism for authentication, is very powerful. In the IoT space, I'm strongly persuaded that we want the devices, each of those IoT devices, to have the ability to reject traffic coming from a source that it can't authenticate. And that probably means configuring it with a public and private key, for example, and telling it, don't listen to anything that doesn't have this public key that you can validate, with a suitable exchange. So things like that, those design practices, I think, really have to become part of the norm if we're going to raise the level of security for everybody.
Yeah, you touched on compliance, which is often a dirty word because people see it as you're going to tell me things I cannot do. But on the other hand, this is another way of switching things around and actually paying compliance as a competitive benefit, right? Because you're talking about doing this internationally. What if we had a situation where we say, if you're not implementing this minimum level of security, you don't get to play, you don't get to connect. But if you do, it actually opens up doors for you so you can have more engagement across the world. Do you think we need to shift our language to sort of spin this as a positive, but not as a negative?
Yes, although you can see a hazard here. One possibility is that you'll remove competition, which some people might like, because you make the compliance requirements so severe that a startup can't meet them. So this is not to argue in favor of insecurity so that startups can happen. That is not my point. But I am suggesting that we need to think very carefully about how to establish standards that are implementable. Open source may be helpful here, although I think everyone in this call knows that open source does not mean that all the bugs have been found. In fact, I suspect that open source means there are more bugs in there because everybody assumes somebody else found the bugs. And of course, the answer is because of that assumption, nobody bothers, in which case buggy code is more likely to be in the open source library than any place else. We need to work on that. In fact, I can imagine investing time and energy going through the open source libraries, evaluating that source code for bugs, as a contribution to everybody.
Yeah.
So I can imagine the government sponsoring something like that, just on the presumption that open source is being used increasingly. And consequently, risk factors are going up unless we make the open source stuff safer.
Right. I have a question from Mark in the chat here, and it's a simple question, but he says, how do we get the public to respond to threats? Especially given the level of knowledge for the general public, the lack of cybersecurity people there to explain this stuff. And even at the national level, you look at Congress, sometimes they kind of think there needs to be some more education going on around there. So how do we get the public overall to respond to threats out there?
Well, just as a reminder, one of the rules we have at the state level is that you can't drive a car unless you pass a driver's test. And I'm not necessarily arguing we should have an internet driver's license exactly, but I actually think that there ought to be some deliberate practices in schools teaching people about the risk factors and safer behaviors in the online environments. And of course, that'll evolve over time, depending on what kinds of software and hardware are available. But I think people should, it's like telling kids to look both ways before they cross the street. You need to have some cyber literacy in order to be safer, not necessarily absolutely safe, but safer in these online environments. Why would we not want people growing up to learn those things? And of course, the adults who are working, to the extent that their ignorance puts a company at risk, companies should be interested in training their employees to exercise cyber hygiene, and that makes not only themselves but the company safer. So I'm looking for reward kinds of things. And speaking of rewards, another crazy idea that occurred to me was that we should have badges for Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and some of the other organizations like that for learning how to make things more secure. And maybe we could have them go and configure people's Wi-Fi servers and routers and things like that to be more secure, because the average family probably doesn't know how to do that.
Yeah, I love that idea, and I'm always of the opinion that this is something that we really are going to have to invest in the younger generation, starting from elementary school all the way up, because this is going to take a generational effort to kind of get this thing done, to change mindsets like that. I love that idea.
I'm looking at the chat and some of Mark's comments. Let me suggest one other crazy idea that I had, which has actually got tested. I thought about the cyber fire department. So here's what I'm thinking. Look, places like Google and IBM and Amazon and Microsoft have enormous IT departments and lots of people who work on cybersecurity, some of them who are developing new technology, some standards and the like. But the average run-of-the-mill small and medium-sized enterprise has Joe, who took a class in how to use a spreadsheet, and he's the IT department. So it's often the case that the SMEs don't have much support for cybersecurity. If we had a cyber fire department, you could imagine you're an SME and you're on cyber fire, you call the cyber fire department, and they come out and help. And there was an experiment along those lines in Michigan. The state of Michigan actually created, I don't think they called it a cyber fire department, but that's what it was. And they had a group of, like, I don't know, 30 or 50 people who were available to respond to people with cyber problems. Now, I have to warn you that the analogy is potentially hazardous, because you can imagine that, let's suppose, Lee, you and I are running businesses and we're competitors. And you would never do this, but I might. I decide to call the cyber fire department and tell them that your company is on fire. And so they would come roaring out and they interfere with everything for the next 2 days. Meanwhile, I'm making money because you can't do any work. So we clearly have to avoid those sorts of gaming practices. But it seems to me that DHS is a place where such concepts might be reasonable, because they have a responsibility for protecting the interior of the United States. And that includes, the fire departments and the police departments and the EMTs, and it might also include some kind of a cyber fire department as well.
Absolutely, that's a great analogy, a way to look at it. They also have a number of students. All these universities have students doing cybersecurity classes. Can you imagine if they were involved in something like that, first responders getting real world experience in cybersecurity? That would be cool. So I like that idea a lot. Vint, I did want to touch on something a little bit more specific that I often hear you talk about. Right now, we're getting ready to run out of IPv4 addresses. And that's going to be a big deal for us, not just the fact that we're running out of addresses, but also the idea that IPv6 was implemented a long time ago, and it's still not, we're not at 50% yet in implementation. Why is it taking so long, do you think?
Well, of course, I've been asking myself that question since 1996. Here's the scenario. We recognize, first of all, Bob and I did a calculation way back in the early 1970s about how big an address space did we need to do an experiment. And remember, it wasn't known that this whole architecture was going to work. This was all very speculative. So we did a little bit of math and ended up with 4.3 billion terminations in a 32-bit address if it was densely populated. And that was more than there were people in the whole world at the time. And so we figured, okay, that's enough to do an experiment. And I honestly thought that if this all worked, if TCP/IP worked, that then, and remember, this is a DoD-sponsored thing, that we would then do a production version. Well, I guess IPv6 is the production version. But I want you to think a little bit about the timing of all this. 1992 is when IETF recognized that it needed to do something to increase the address space. So they had multiple proposals, and there were lots of pitched battles over which choices to make, and eventually they ended up with IPv6. That was 1996. Now, what do we know about 1996? Well, we know that that's the year after Netscape Communications went public and its stock went through the roof. The dot boom was on right at the point where IPv6 was standardized. And so everybody looks at the v4 address space in 1996 and says, man, we got lots of room. Hardly anything has been used up. Forget about that. Let's just focus on the dot boom. And so everybody paid attention to building applications and building their companies and building routers and building everything else. Anything that had anything to do with internet is receiving all kinds of money from the venture capital world until the dot bust in April of 2000. But even then, the internet continued to grow at a substantial pace. So the incentive for implementing IPv6 was somewhat limited. Now, having said that, I have to point out that the routers and most of the edge devices are capable of doing IPv6. The software is there. It's just that it hasn't been turned on by the ISPs. And so if there's anybody I would shake a stick at, it would be the ISPs turning on IPv6. Some of them will tell you, well, yeah, we could do that, but then I have to replace the router that people have, and they don't want to pay me for that. And there are a number of excuses that you might hear. But it seems to me that we're at the point where we really should do something. We can continue to do this natting, and in some pieces, we're seeing double natting and triple natting, and it's horrible, but it sort of works, but only for certain kinds of applications. It does not work for peer-to-peer kinds of initiation, which we are going to need in the IoT space, for example. So I am of the opinion that between IoT and mobiles, which increasingly are v6 capable, that will be one of the drivers that push us into IPv6 space. I certainly hope so, because it's been a very long time since 1996, and I'm getting tired of waiting.
Yeah, I agree. I think now with our fridges and microwaves and everything having an IP address, it's bound to happen much faster over time. You also touched on this earlier in the conversation about the idea of end-to-end authentication. But I always wonder from your talks, what do you mean by end-to-end authentication? And can you talk about the global impact of doing that, internationally?
Sure. Well, the classic example of end-to-end authentication would be two devices, each of which have a public and private key. And they can verify that they have the matching private key that goes along with the public key. And so that's a way of authenticating both devices on the presumption, of course, that you have been able to associate the public key with something you care about. So if the public key is associated with a device that you care about, and you can verify that that device has the private key that matches the public key, and if both devices handshake that way, then that's a kind of end-to-end authentication. Now, the certificate authorities are one way of achieving that objective. The problem with the certificate authority concept, of course, is that if the certificate authority is compromised and it issues a certificate that makes somebody pretend to be X, Y, or Z, for example, hi, I'm Microsoft, and here's a new piece of code for you to download. If a certificate authority issues such a certificate with Microsoft or Google's or Amazon's or what have you, domain name in it, even if it's a fake, then that puts you at risk. So we have arguments about whether certificate authorities are the right way to achieve this kind of end-to-end authentication, or whether there are others. There's an example of using the domain name system itself and the zones within the domain name using an architecture called DANE, D-A-N-E, which would allow us to embed public keys in the domain name system infrastructure. Now, the domain name system is already getting kind of heavily overloaded with a variety of different functions, but that might be an alternative to certificate authorities. But the idea here is that for the devices to be able to confirm that they still have the private key that goes with the public key, and as long as you are assured that a device that can exhibit that capability is the one that you wanted to talk to, then that's one way of achieving end-to-end authentication.
And Vin, as you know, this is going to have significant implications for individuals, right? Regardless of whether you work for a company or not. And so is this one of the things that you're thinking that the governments need to get involved in? Because if everybody is going to, let's say we're using PKI as a solution for this, if everybody needs to have a certificate, those things cost money. So, like we have passports or we have driver's license, do you think this is something where state and federal governments are going to have to get involved in helping to identify people and things going forward?
Well, I think the answer is probably. There's some prominent examples in the world where governments have specifically gotten involved in these things. In Estonia, for example, the government issues certificates, ID certificates, and you can get one if you want to. You don't have to be a citizen of Estonia to get one of these IDs. So you, in the end, if you really needed to identify someone and you want the identity to be somehow certified, it's almost impossible to avoid having some government involvement in that. Just like the states issue driver's licenses, which we often use as an authenticator of our identity. The thing which worries me a lot these days is that because of the vulnerability of so much of the components of the internet, and because the internet is largely insensitive to the transport of packets across national boundaries, there are risk factors that we see in headlines all the time where some attacker in one country or one jurisdiction attacks someone in another jurisdiction. And unless there is cooperation on a national or an international basis, it may be very hard to track down someone who is harming others. So I reach the same conclusion that the Secretary General of the United Nations has reached, which is that we need digital cooperation across international boundaries if we are going to improve the safety of the internet and the tracking down of people who are causing harm. This also creates some tension between anonymity and identity. And I believe that although anonymity is attractive, for example, for whistleblowing, or for certain kinds of activity which should not, your identity should be irrelevant, like searching the internet or searching the World Wide Web, I think that we are inescapably going to end up with a need to uncover identity under conditions where it's required. And so if you're a court order might be required to make this, to do a reveal. I'll give you an imperfect analogy here. Think about license plates for a moment. Mostly license plates just look like, random characters. And yet the police department has the ability to ask to translate the license plate into owner of car. Most of us general citizens don't have the facility to do that. Although the last time I said that, somebody pointed out there's some server somewhere on the internet that actually does that. So much for anonymity. But the point here is that the idea that you have anonymity up to a limit, but then beyond that, you have to be discoverable, I think is not an unreasonable position to take if we are going to enforce any kind of control over bad behaviors. If we can't identify the parties who are harming others, it's very hard to bring them to justice. This is not, however, an argument that says that we should put back doors into crypto and all the other debates that are going on. I think strong cryptographic techniques are important to preserve privacy and safety, and they should not be penetrated. But we do have to accept the possibility that identity can't be absolutely, or that anonymity cannot be absolutely assured.
Absolutely. And just in that answer, you touched on a number of facets of security that I consider outside of the realm of IT. I mean, you touched on laws, you touched on the different things that we need to do. And so that sort of brings me to something that I often think about as cybersecurity as what I call a wicked problem. And I think it needs a multidisciplinary approach for us to even get close to solving this thing. We can no longer just depend on the technology piece of it. We got to focus on human psychology, the sort of people-centric design. There's a marketing element to it. There's a legal aspects. We really have to look at this from all different angles. So I'm wondering, are there parallels that you can think about during the creation and development of today's internet, where there could have been more engagement from non-engineers, right, involved in developing the internet as we know it today?
So I'm a big fan of, sorry about the phone ringing in the background. I don't know if you can hear that, but just ignore it.
Yep.
It's somebody asking for money, almost certainly. We're in the middle of elections in Virginia, and so.
Oh yeah, always is.
I have often believed that we should have anthropologists and sociologists and neuropsychiatrists or neuropsychologists as part of the team of developing computer-based systems. And the reason for that is that we see how those systems and the applications that are built on top of them lead to all kinds of human behaviors, some of which are self-destructive or harmful of others. And I think that we need to understand human behavior better than we do when we're building systems like this. I think this is especially true when it comes to looking at social networking, where we see behaviors that are exacerbated sometimes by the incentive structure of the social networking application. So understanding that and learning how to defend against it, learning how to create incentives for people to behave differently than they are, whether it's self-destructive behavior or behavior that's harmful to others. So I'm with you on having a much broader palette of expertise available when we start thinking about cyber-based systems, as opposed to thinking of them strictly as being a computer science problem to be solved. This is a much more general one, as you point out.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I actually enjoy working on university campuses, because I kind of feel like you have the answer there. You have all the people you just mentioned are usually on a university campus, but they typically don't work together. I'm starting to see a little bit of that changing now. We have a multidisciplinary group of people working on the same grants and doing the same research. Are you seeing some of that in your experience, not just on a university setting, but out there in the corporate world as well?
Oh, I think that it's inescapable. I think a lot of companies, ours included, recognize that the problems that we're trying to cope with are not solvable with pure technology. And in fact, I worry that legislators don't necessarily get that. And so as an example, this enormous microscopic focus on machine learning, for example, as if it's the solution to everything, worries me. Because there's some people who appear to think that if we just got the algorithms right, everything would be okay. Or if you just expose the algorithm so everybody can see it, everything will be okay. Well, there are two problems with that. The first one is that sometimes exposing the algorithm opens you up to gaming, which defeats the purpose of the algorithm in the first place. It's kind of like the people who make cash ATM machines and need to figure out, did you just put in a $20 bill or a $5 bill or a $1 bill? They actually look not at the whole thing, but at certain places on the bill that you feed in. They don't tell you where they're looking because they don't want you to stick in a fake that has just those places with exactly the right stuff on it to be mistaken as a $20 bill. It's just like the IRS doesn't tell you what they look at in your tax return to figure out whether they should audit your return. So there are some things about algorithms that have to be kept secret. On the other hand, I worry that some algorithms are not easily explained, and especially those in the machine learning world, where the algorithm basically is this gigantic stack of probability vectors, which when combined produce a result. And if somebody says, so what was the algorithm? And the answer is, well, I combined 17 million parameters into this decision. And most people would find that unsatisfying. And so there is effort going to try to explain things, but I think in the classic, if I could use that word, machine learning world, that's turning out to be really hard. Even in the older environment, you remember the way in which we used to do these things was rule-based systems. If this, then that. And you have hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of these if then else rules. And this, you could kind of trace your way back. It comes out with a conclusion, so you work your way back to find out how did we get here. And that sort of offered an explanation. However, it also turns out that when you have that many rules, there's often conflicts. And you don't know this because there's so many rules, you can't keep it all straight. And so you may end up with inconsistent results as a result, depending on where you started in the rule-based system. So we are a long ways away from being able to easily explain what it is that these algorithms are doing. And I think the oversimplification by some people that it's just a question of getting the right algorithm, I don't buy that. I think that this is deeper. This is not just about algorithms, it's about incentives. It's about digital literacy. It's about making things easier for people to exercise safer behaviors, all of which go well beyond simply fashioning a particular algorithm to solve a particular problem.
So are you saying we're still going to need people who can think? The computers are not just going to take over and do our works, our jobs for us?
I am doubtful that that will happen. Well, we could let something happen, which I think would be wrong. That's allowing algorithms to make decisions for us that we should be making. I frankly think of a lot of the machine learning stuff as being extremely powerful and useful tools. I mean, machine language translation or language translation by machine is actually turning out to be extremely feasible with the new machine learning technologies. And I find it extremely helpful because there are a lot of languages I don't speak and I get email in some of them. So translations are very, very helpful, even if they're not perfect. They give you a gist of what's going on. There are a lot of other diagnostic procedures that will benefit from computer power, whether it's based on machine learning and AI-like things or more conventional kinds of supercomputer computations. One of the most interesting machine learning results to come out recently is from DeepMind, which is one of the alphabet companies. And that was they figured out how to fold proteins that are being generated by mRNA interpretation. And they managed to essentially correctly predict, as far as we know, some, 88,000 different proteins that are generated in the human body by our DNA. And the fact that they could get that many of them apparently right is pretty astonishing. So computers have had a role to play in the pandemic, for example, in helping to fashion the vaccines. So I see these as really powerful tools. We should not allow them to dictate what we do.
And that's a great place to wrap up that section, because I think that's where we get in trouble. and we start thinking that the human brain somehow is not going to be necessary in this whole thing. And it's true for the security space as well. A lot of security equipment manufacturers sort of market these single pane of glass things, or these silver bullet things that can be used to solve all our problems. And sometimes even sold in such a way that we're not going to need analysts anymore. And I totally reject that. I think we're always going to have the human beings working together with these machines. And as things evolve, we're going to have to just evolve together as we try to solve this problem.
Well, there is a scaling issue here. And just to give you an example, YouTube gets something like 400 hours of video uploaded per minute. I mean, just think about that, 400 hours per minute. It's just, so we don't have enough people to go look at all this. So we have to find algorithms that we can train to help us discover content that doesn't belong on YouTube. And there would be no other obvious solution to that problem. So we do have to make use of these tools where we can, but we also have to recognize that they're not perfect and they need to be iterated in order to make them function better. There was something else I wanted to, okay. On the security side, one of the things that's very valuable is logging what is happening. And of course, with large scale computational environments, there's a lot of stuff to log. But those logs can be tremendously helpful if something goes wrong, because then you can go back and look. But the important thing is go back and look. The important thing is audit the logs. Don't just take the logs and hope that they are useful and then never use them. It's a little bit like backups. I don't know how many people on this call have ever had the experience of religiously running backups and then one day trying to actually use it and discovering it was never backing anything up. It was never writing anything, or it was only partially writing things. So if you're going to do logging, which I think is a good idea, then you better do some auditing. You better make use of those logs to figure out whether or not they're doing what you need them to do. So I'm a big fan of auditing.
Yep, auditing, knowing what to do with it, and that's where the machines can also help. So Vint, just sort of connecting back the historical piece with you and the creation of the internet and sort of watching it come to what it is today. If you look into the future, people are talking about machine learning and cloud and big data. All these things are what we're kind of like focusing on, IoT, and people think machines are going to take over the world eventually. What would you say from in terms of lessons learned in the past that we need to look at going into the future so that the technologies continue to enhance the way we live and we don't destroy ourselves with technology?
Well, one flippant answer to your question is, what do you mean someday the machines will take over the world? They already have, and you just haven't noticed.
There we go.
I'm half serious about that, and let me say why. I believe that at least many of us on this planet are very dependent on extremely complex technology. And when it isn't available, lots of things don't work. And so I see this continual buildup of dependency on very complex infrastructure. Even something as simple as electrical power turns out to be pretty fundamental, because you can't run the internet or all of your laptops, desktops, mobiles, pads, watches, and so on without it. So you need electrical power. In the absence of that, a huge dependency suddenly collapses. And a very good example of another collapse I mentioned earlier is the Colonial Pipeline, which showed that if you couldn't get fuel to places that needed it, that your supply chains collapsed because people couldn't deliver goods and services. So I'm worried that with the advent of computers, which are the most powerful and flexible tool ever invented so far, that we have also built up this enormous dependency on technology, which interacts in ways that we can't always predict, or which fails in ways that we can't predict, and or don't know how to avoid. So some people will go down the path of, well, we need to build more resilient systems, we need to gold plate everything. That increases cost, and that may drive things out of reasonable range. The other alternative might be to think about, how do I do rapid recovery? You might think about pre-positioning equipment, for example, to deal with the failure after a flood. Instead of trying to build things that are so redundant that the flood doesn't wipe them out, you pre-position this stuff so that after the flood is over, you can send equipment in quickly to reconstitute some capability. But we need to think more, I think, about the resilience and redundancy of the infrastructure that we're depending on. And we better have some backup capabilities. I mean, when the airlines computers go down, everything comes to a grinding halt because you don't know where the planes are, you don't know where the spare parts are, you don't know where the customers are. We're really heavily dependent on this stuff, and we need to find ways of making it more reliable than it is today. Otherwise, we will experience, I would think, an increasing number of cascade failures, which we can ill afford.
Absolutely. So Vint, just sort of wrap it up, the last thing I have for you is, we have, as I said, we have a multifaceted audience here today. We have students, we have practitioners, federal government, state government, and so on. Just what advice do you have for folks about, as we create sort of the next generation of the internet, right? Hopefully more securely. What advice do you have for the individual constituents here today about going forward?
So, well, the simple piece of advice is, if you want to do something big, get some help. Don't be afraid to ask for help. And in particular, look for people who are smarter than you are. In my case, that's not hard. And I've been benefited enormously from lots of people who decided they wanted to do what I wanted to do. And so that's the other side of the coin. Get help and learn how to sell your ideas so other people want to help you. You know, the best example I can think of that is Tom Sawyer whitewashing a fence in the book by Mark Twain. And he convinces his friends that whitewashing the fence is fun. And he offers them an apple core and reward. And, you know, if that isn't a fantastic sales job, I don't know what else is. So getting people to want to do what you want to do and selling them on that idea is the best way forward to doing something really big and significant. Get some help. Now, I see that there's a question there that says, I'm curious about any thoughts regarding risks hiding in the vast opportunity of brain-machine interfaces and other advanced forms of human-machine interfaces. So let me give you a quick observation about that. At the moment, here in 2021, we actually have a very good understanding of what we'll call sensory neural interfaces and sensory motor interfaces, somewhat less so, but still those two things, sensory motor and sensory neural, we are understanding increasingly well. My wife has 2 cochlear implants, for example, and that requires us understanding how the brain detects sound and then simulating that by electrically stimulating the auditory nerve using a computer program that makes the brain think it's hearing sound. And this works spectacularly well. So we understand sensory neural for a number of different cases: touch, sound, not so much smell. And we also are learning how to do sensory motor. And so for people with spinal injuries or other kinds of injuries that interfere with their ability to use their hands and feet and so on, we're starting to learn how to generate signals that our neural system and our muscular system will properly interpret as directives to move. So those 2 areas, I think, are ripe for further exploration. I don't think, however, that we have any concept of cognitive representations. We don't know how to present the brain with a cognitive thought. And you know, I know that Elon Musk has got his little flexible chip and everything, but I think that we should be careful not to mistake that for cognitive interfaces. The ones that are realistic, I think, are sensory neural and sensory motor.
Awesome. So Vint, I know you have a lot to do for the rest of the day, so I want to just thank you for this wonderful session and for giving us some of your time today. It's been a pleasure. It's been 2 years or 3 years we're trying to get you to come to this conference, and we finally had it done this time around. thanks to the help of some folks from the NSRC and other places. But it's been a pleasure talking to you. And welcome back anytime to this conference. Hopefully next year and beyond.
Thank you very much. Let me give a shout out to NSRC and Steve Hooter, its director. We've known each other for many, many years, and I have a ready-made excuse to come back to Eugene, partly to see Steve and his team at NSRC. Happy to come chat with you as well. But also, we're big fans of the Pinot Noirs in the Willamette Valley. And
Awesome.
So that's another good reason to come back. And once we can start traveling again, that will be a favored destination.
Well, if it's possible, let's hope it's October next year, because this is when we do the conference again. But it's been a pleasure.
I look forward to that very much. Meanwhile, I'll see you on the net.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Vint.
Bye-bye for now.